It is a common and charming trope that any Israeli schoolchild could, if given the opportunity, open one of the 2,000-year-old Dead Sea Scrolls containing, say, the book of Isaiah, and read it. But this is pure fiction. Why? Because first, the hypothetical child would have to learn to identify the shapes of the letters used by scribes at the end of the first millennium BCE. The letters would look like those in the column somewhat right of center labeled Jewish. While many of the letters are easy to recognize, some take some getting used to. Then the child would have to be sufficiently familiar with biblical grammar, vocabulary, and idiom to make sense of Hebrew that was some 5,000 years older than even the scroll itself. Because to a child who hadn't studied much more Tanakh than the typical secular Israeli, the language of Isaiah would come about as naturally as Shakespeare does to an American elementary school student. But suppose the child overcame all these obstacles and read the text fluently. As long as we're engaging in an imaginary scenario, let's add one more element to the picture. A contemporary of Isaiah, transported from the 7th century BCE, listening to the child's reading. What would that listener hear? The answer, I submit, is that to him, what he would hear would be near gibberish. Let me give you a sense of what I think his experience would be. I'll play a reading of a passage of Tanakh that you probably know very well. The only difference from our version of the text is that where we say Adonai in place of the Tetragrammaton, you'll hear the speaker say Shema. If you want to follow along, the text that he's reading is on the right.
Yes. I start? Please. In ancient Hebrew.
Yes.
Shema Yisrael, Shema Elohim, Shema Ad, وابطأ شما إلوك أفكل لبابك وافكل نفسك وافكل مئودك ويودي باريما إلا إشر آناك أمصابك أيما اللي بابك شننت ما قلبانك ودبرتا بما أبشبتك ببيت أبليكتك بديرك بشكابك وفقومك وقاشرت ما نوت على يدك ويوالتا طافت بن إينك وكاتبت مع المازوز وتبتك وبشارك. Okay.
Okay. Did you get that? This time, let me put the text on the screen in a form that you'll be able to read more easily. And let's listen again.
Yes. I start? Please. In ancient Hebrew.
Yes.
Shema Yisrael, Shema Elohim, Shema Ad, وابطأ شما إلوك أفكل لبابك وافكل نفسك وافكل مئودك ويودي باريما إلا إشر آناك أمصابك أيما اللي بابك شننت ما قلبانك ودبرتا بما أبشبتك ببيت أبليكتك بديرك بشكابك وفقومك وقاشرت ما نوت على يدك ويوالتا طافت بن إينك وكاتبت مع المازوز وتبتك وبشارك.
I think that this is roughly how strange our Hebrew reading would sound to a 7th century BCE Judean. Why? Because it's not just the way the letters are written or the vocabulary and grammar of Hebrew that have changed over the years. The sound of the language has changed dramatically too, to the extent that I think that if Moses miraculously appeared before us and today and spoke, we'd be lucky to understand just a word or two here and there. The fact of the matter is that although our biblical texts have been copied for thousands of years by one generation of scribes after another, when it comes to the sounds of the language, we have been engaging in what is basically a 3,000-year-long game of telephone. Sure, the written text gives us a good deal of information about the sounds of the language, but as we'll see, we still depend on an oral tradition as to how to read what is written. And if you've ever played telephone, and seeing what can happen in just a couple of minutes, you can begin to imagine the magnitude of the changes that have occurred in the pronunciation of Hebrew over the millennia. The video I showed you is one that I took several years ago during a visit to the Samaritan community on Mount Gerizim, just outside Nablus, which is biblical Shechem. And the individual reading it was a Samaritan priest. The Samaritans split off from what we consider mainstream Judaism some 2,500 years ago. We don't know exactly when we parted company from each other linguistically, but before we did, we both read our similar biblical texts more or less the same way. Yet, as you can see, the ways that we read them today are virtually mutually unintelligible. The difference reflects the two chains of telephone that began at the point of the split. It's not that the way the Samaritan priest reads it is correct and ours is not, or vice versa. Both ways of reading have evolved, or you could say mutated, from their common ancestor. Now, tracing all the changes that have occurred in the pronunciation of Hebrew could occupy many years of study. So tonight I will limit myself to just a couple of vignettes illustrating those changes, some relating to Hebrew's consonants and others to Hebrew's vowels. Let me start with an easy question. How many consonants are there in Hebrew? For the linguistically sophisticated among you, I actually mean consonant phonemes, but I'll use the word consonant for now. Actually, there isn't one answer to this question. Standard Israeli Hebrew, in which several letters are pronounced like others, such as Aleph and Ayin and Kaf and Kuf, has about 19. The Hebrew alphabet, on the other hand, suggests that Biblical Hebrew had 23 consonants, represented by 22 graphic symbols or letters, of which one, sin/shin, did double duty. And then, of course, there are the alternate pronunciations of the so-called Beged Kefet letters, the letters that are pronounced differently with and without a dot in pointed Hebrew. But let's set those aside. Their dual pronunciation is a relative latecomer on the Hebrew stage. Now, Hebrew is a member of a large family of languages known as the Semitic languages. Other members of the family include Arabic and Aramaic, as well as Akkadian, which is the language of many cuneiform texts. By comparing the Semitic languages, scholars have been able to recover a great deal of information about these languages' earliest ancestor, which is referred to as Proto-Semitic. And Proto-Semitic is reconstructed as having had no fewer than 29 and perhaps even 30 consonants. This is more than any of the daughter languages. Only Classical Arabic with 28 comes close. So what happened to the 6 or 7 consonants that Hebrew has lost? Several pairs of them, and in one case a threesome, merged into single consonants. For example, in Proto-Semitic, there was a consonant pronounced th, as in think. In Hebrew, that consonant merged with the consonant pronounced sh. So a Proto-Semitic word like thauru, which meant ox, survives in Hebrew. But because the consonants for th and sh merged in Hebrew the word takes the form shor. In Aramaic, by contrast, th merged with the consonant t, which is why in Chad Gadya, the word for shore is Torah, ve'ata Torah, v'shata lemaya. You'll be relieved to know that I won't be going through this next chart in detail, but if you look at the Hebrew row, the red letters represent cases where Proto-Semitic consonants were lost in Hebrew and merged into other consonants. But lurking beneath the surface of Biblical Hebrew's 23 consonants, there may actually lie 2 more Proto-Semitic consonants that our Hebrew-speaking ancestors used, for a total of 25. Where Hebrew now has a single consonant represented by the letter ayin, Proto-Semitic had two separate consonants. One was similar to today's ayin, as pronounced in the pharynx by a dwindling minority of Hebrew speakers today, while the other was pronounced ghayin, sort of like a ch sound with voicing at the same time, ghayin. And similarly, where Hebrew now has het, as pronounced by so-called Mizrahi Jews, Proto-Semitic had two consonants, one pronounced het and the other chet, het, chet. And there's good reason to think that when the Tanakh was written, Hebrew speakers pronounced the letter ayin in some words and ghayin in others, and that they pronounced the letter het in some words and chet in others. How do we know? If all we had were texts written in Hebrew, we probably wouldn't. But we also have texts in other languages in which Hebrew names were transliterated into other alphabets. And these give us information about what the transliterators heard. Ever wonder why the name of the cities Gomorrah and Gaza begin in English with a G, while their Hebrew names, Amorah and Azza, begin with an ayin? After all, the English versions of other names that begin with an ayin in Hebrew, such as the place name Ein Gedi and the name of the Ammonite people, don't begin with a G. The reason is that the English forms of all these names trace back to Greek sources. And when the Greeks first heard these names pronounced, they heard them pronounced differently. Gomorrah and Gaza, they heard beginning with a ghayin, something like Ramorah and Gaza. That's why the Greek transliterations of these names, as you can see, begin with the Greek letter gamma, which continues in the G of our versions of these names. En Gedi and Ammon, on the other hand, they heard with something closer to our pronunciation. And the same thing is true of names that included a het. In the English version of some of those names, there is no trace of the het. For example, Isaac, from Hebrew Yitzhak, where the het has left barely a trace in its English version. On the other hand, in others, it's represented by an H. For example, Hebrew Ahav is Ahab in English. In the case of some names, evidently, the Greeks heard h, which they didn't bother representing with a consonant, while in others, they apparently heard ch, which they represented with the Greek letter chi, which at the time was pronounced ch. Why didn't Hebrew use different letters for ayin and ghayin, and for het and chet, the way it used different letters to distinguish other consonants? The answer is that rather than inventing their own alphabet, which might have had characters to represent all of Hebrew's consonants, Hebrew speakers borrowed an alphabet developed by speakers of another language. That language was Phoenician. And in Phoenician, ayin and ghayin and het and chet had already merged into single consonants. So the Phoenicians' alphabet had just one letter for each. When speakers of Hebrew adopted the Phoenician alphabet, they didn't add letters. Instead, they squeezed Hebrew's 25 consonants, including ghayin, chet, and as we saw, sin, into Phoenician's 22 graphic symbols. It was only when Hebrew also eventually lost its ghayin and chet consonants that the letters ayin and chet became unambiguous as they are today. Let us fast forward many years. By the 8th century, Hebrew had long since stopped serving as the spoken language of any Jewish community, and the need was felt to capture in writing the information that was largely lacking in biblical texts up to that time. As anyone who has ever had to read from a Torah scroll knows, what was most glaringly missing was a complete representation of the vowels. By the way, Jews were probably influenced by a similar project that was taking place at the time among Muslim scholars of the Quran. Members of an academy in the city of Tiberias developed a particularly thorough graphic system for indicating the vowels. That system has come to be known as the Tiberian Masorah, and the school that developed it as the Masoretes. Probably because of the prestige of the academy that produced the system and the system's extraordinary detail and precision, the Tiberian Masorah became the standard way to vocalize biblical texts throughout almost the entire Jewish world. Our printed editions of the Tanakh are all based on the Tiberian Masorah. But for speakers of so-called Sephardic Hebrew, including speakers of modern Hebrew, there are some problems with the Tiberian Masorah. For one, the Tiberian Masorah distinguishes between some vowels where Sephardic speakers don't. Specifically, Sephardic speakers read the vowel ah, where the Tiberian Masorah sometimes has the symbol patach and sometimes has the symbol kamatz. And Sephardic speakers read the vowel where the Tiberian Masorah may have either the symbol segol or the symbol tsere. When the Tiberian Masoretes differentiated between patach and kamatz, and between segol and tsere, they certainly expected these symbols to be read differently from one another. In other words, in place of these 4 Tiberian Masoretic vowels, Sephardic speakers have only 2 vowels. So what happened here? Did Sephardic speakers simply merge each of the 2 pairs of Hebrew vowels into a single vowel, like the 2 consonants that merged into each of ayin and chet? The answer is no. And the actual answer is both more complicated and more interesting. By the time of the Masoretes, Hebrew was no longer a living language. But while it had been preserved and transmitted as a language of prayer, of study, and of course reading biblical texts, this transmission was occurring over an ever-expanding geographical range. So while the Hebrew of all Jewish communities ultimately traced back to a common origin, over time and space, a number of different chains of the game of telephone developed. From manuscript material that survives from the end of the first millennium, most of it from the Cairo Geniza, we know that there were by then at least 3 different Hebrew pronunciation traditions at the end of 3 such chains of telephone. One was the Tiberian tradition, which the Masoretes followed. But there were at least 2 others as well. These are known today as the Palestinian pronunciation tradition and the Babylonian pronunciation tradition. The 3 pronunciation traditions differed in various ways, and one of them was in the number of vowels that they knew. The Tiberian tradition recognized 6 distinct vowels, the Babylonian 6, and the Palestinian just 5. You may notice that in this chart there are 8 Tiberian vowel symbols, not 7, but you'll see that the last 2, kibbutz and shuruk, represent the same vowel. It's simply that the Masoretes used shuruk to represent the vowel u when there was a vav in the consonantal text, and a kibbutz when there wasn't, but they pronounced the vowel the same in either case. One of these pronunciation traditions eventually won out, and it wasn't the Tiberian system. The oral tradition that came to prevail in most of the Jewish world was the Palestinian system, with its 5 vowels. But as we saw, written texts were vocalized in accordance with the prestigious Tiberian Masoretic system. This meant that there was a mismatch between the pronunciation tradition that most Jews inherited and the different pronunciation tradition that was reflected in the vocalized texts that they used. Depending upon your perspective, you could say that Sephardic speakers speak Hebrew incorrectly according to the texts that they use, or that they made a big mistake when they allowed the Tiberian Masoretic texts to take over. But wait, you may say, Not all of the Jewish world has trouble with the Tiberian Masorah. Ashkenazic Jews do distinguish Patach from Kamatz and Segol from Tzere. Aha, say you Ashkenazic Hebrew speakers. We are the faithful heirs of the Tiberian Masoretic tradition, and we read Hebrew the way it was supposed to be read. But not so fast. Here again, the story is more complicated and surprising. The evidence is that well into the second millennium CE, Ashkenazic Jews did not distinguish between Patach and Kamatz, and between Segol and Tzere. How do we know? The evidence is found in the large number of manuscripts from that period in which Patach and Kamatz and Segol and Tzere are interchanged almost randomly, as if the scribes heard no difference between them and more or less just winged it when deciding which one to use. But then something changed, and within a couple of centuries, these errors largely disappeared. The explanation is not that Ashkenazi scribes started getting better training. Rather, it apparently had to do with changes that occurred in German, and especially in the dialect of German that we have come to know as Yiddish. There were two developments. First, in a number of German dialects, including Yiddish, speakers began shifting from pronouncing ah in open syllables to pronouncing it aw or oo. And then a little later, Yiddish speakers started shifting from pronouncing eh in open syllables to a or I. When these phonetic shifts occurred in their everyday language, Yiddish speakers carried them over into the way that they pronounced the same vowels when reading Hebrew. Now it happens that Kamatz and Tzere, for reasons that I won't go into here, appear in the Hebrew of the Tiberian Masorah predominantly in open syllables. In other words, in precisely the phonetic environment in which the vowel ah shifted in Yiddish to o or u, the Tiberian Masorah more often than not had a Kamatz. And in precisely the environment in which the vowel eh shifted to a or I, the Tiberian Masorah had a Tzere. As a result, the Kamatz symbol came to be associated by Ashkenazic Jews with the sound o or u, and the Tzere symbol with a or I, and Ashkenazic pronunciation changed accordingly. These changes made Ashkenazic Hebrew appear to reflect a feature of the Tiberian pronunciation tradition, but the similarity came about largely by happenstance. Well, that's a lot more information than you probably bargained for. So let me leave you with just one more piece of show and tell. As we have seen, Ashkenazic Hebrew is a descendant of the Palestinian pronunciation tradition, not the Tiberian. In fact, the pronunciation tradition of the Tiberian Masoretes died out shortly after they completed their work, and no living Jewish community preserves it. But fortunately, the Masoretes not only produced manuscripts in their system, but they also wrote works in Arabic describing their system and explaining it. These works have enabled scholars to reconstruct how Hebrew sounded in the mouths of the Tiberian Masoretes. Earlier this year, Jeffrey Kahn, that's K-H-A-N, a professor of Semitic languages at the University of Cambridge, who has done a great deal of work in this area, published a major new book on just this subject. And included with it are recordings of the reconstructed pronunciation of the Tiberian Masoretes. So to conclude, I'll play a recording of the first verses of Breshit, which I'll also put up on the screen. I'm sure that you'll find the Hebrew of the Masoretes much easier to understand and recognize than the Samaritan priests. After all, our separation from the Tiberian pronunciation tradition occurred a lot more recently than our separation from the Samaritans. Some of the differences that you will hear are the pronunciation of certain consonants, especially the so-called emphatic consonants, tet, kuf, and sadi. If you pay careful attention, you may also notice two different pronunciations of the consonant resh, and you'll hear the letter taf pronounced th when it is not dotted. Finally, pay attention to the pronunciation of the shvaim, specifically if you know the terminology, the mobile shvaim or shvaim na'im. The Tiberian Masorete's rules for pronouncing them are quite different than ours.
בראשית בורו אלוהים את השמיים ואת הארץ. והארץ הוי תוהו ובוהו, וחושך על פני תהום, ורוח אלוהים מרחפת על פני המים. ויאמר אלוהים יהי אור, ויהי אור. וירא אלוהים את האור כי טוב, ויבדיל אלוהים בין האור ובין החושך. ויקרא אלוהים לאור יום, ולחושך קרא לילה. ויהי ערב, ויהי בוקר, יום אחד. ויאמר אלוהים יהי רקיע בתוך המים, ויהי מבדיל בין מים למים. ויעש אלוהים את הרקיע, ויבדיל בין המים אשר מתחת לרקיע, ובין המים אשר מעל לרקיע, ויהי כן. ויקרא אלוהים לרקיע שמיים, ויהי ערב, ויהי בוקר, יום שני. ויאמר אלוהים יקרבו המים מתחת השמיים אל מקום אחד, ותראה היבשה, ויהי כן. ויקרא אלוהים ליבשה ארץ, ולמקווה המים קרא ימים. וירא אלוהים כי טוב. ויאמר אלוהים תדשה הארץ דשא, עשב מזריע, זרע עץ פרי עושה פרי למינו, אשר זרעו על הארץ. ויהי כן. ותעשה הארץ דשא, עשב מזריע, זרע למינו, ועץ עושה פרי, אשר זרעו למינו. וירא אלוהים כי טוב. ויהי ערב, ויהי בוקר, יום שלישי.
So, earlier generations really did speak Hebrew oddly to our ears. But of course, by their standards, so do we. And I imagine a session, say 500 years from now, by Zoom perhaps, in which they'll listen to recordings of us reading Tanakh and talk about how odd we sound. And what is the right way to pronounce Hebrew? That, I hope you now understand a little better than before, is anything but a simple question. Thank you for your attention.